Take a moment to picture something completely ordinary, your electric bill. You open it. On your phone or from the envelope in your mailbox, just look at it. Don't look at the amount, not the due date, just the way it looks. You see something different. There's a small chart you don't remember seeing before. Clean, simple.
It's a bar chart showing how much electricity you used last month. But that's not the surprising part. Right next to your bar are two others. One labeled your neighbors, and the other, the most efficient neighbors. And suddenly you realize this isn't just a bill anymore. It's a comparison. You look at your bar, and it's a little higher than your average neighbor, and even higher than your super efficient neighbors. Ugh. And here's the interesting thing. There's no blatant scolding in the bill, no big red arrow pointing at you, no penalty, no extra fee, just 3 bars, sitting there quietly, showing you the people on your block who somehow seem to have figured out how to use a lot less electricity than you did last month.
Now pause for a second in this imaginary scene. What happens next? Do you immediately go to your thermostat and dial it down a few degrees? Do you go around the house and shut off a bunch of lights? Do you adjourn a family meeting to discuss how you're going to lower your energy use? Probably nothing so dramatic. However, does something subtle shift inside you, something that you're not quite aware of? Could there be a small and unconscious something that got into your brain, and that tiny little thing ends up influencing your behavior?
That moment isn't hypothetical. More than 120 million households around the world have received utility bills with that exact little chart showing how their energy use compares to their neighbors. And when researchers tested this concept, simply showing people how their energy consumption compared to others like them, people ended up using less energy. And remember, this is not because they were forced to, not because they were reminded of the money they would save or how turning off lights is good for the environment, not even because of their concerns for saving the world for future generations. No, this was because the moment you see that chart, something very human kicks in: social comparison. And most of us, whether we realize it or not, don't like being the outlier. We want to fit in. We're social creatures. We are wired to look around and ask a simple question: what are people like me doing? And if everyone on my block is using less energy than I am, suddenly my behavior doesn't feel quite right anymore.
This insight became the foundation for a company called Opower. In 2007, they started redesigning energy bills so people could see something that they had never seen before: how their electricity use compared to their neighbors. With that simple change, Opower made the invisible visible.
And we had this kind of realization of like, you can stop at any stop sign and look around and see, you kind of know how you rank. My Civic is super efficient and that guy's Hummer is super inefficient. But we had no idea if we were living in a Humvee apartment or in a Prius apartment. And that kind of like, wouldn't it be nice just to know how we stack up?
That was Alex Lasky, the entrepreneur who, with his business partner Dan Yates, was trying to come up with an environmentally focused business idea. They both wanted to create a business that would be profitable and would be good for the world. Then a chance conversation accelerated everything. Dan had a meeting with Ria Sue, who at the time was leading environmental initiatives at the Hewlett Foundation. Dan brought along something pretty ordinary: his utility bill. Here's Dan.
And I waved around my utility bill and talked about what a mess it was and said, I just want to see how I compare to my neighbors. And her eyes went wide and she said, you won't believe this, but we just finished funding a study in Southern California that showed that if you compare energy use to neighbors, that people really reduce it. And that was sort of what started it all.
That moment changed everything. Alex and Dan tracked down the research paper Dan had just learned about, the study showing that simply comparing people's energy use to their neighbors could reduce energy consumption. And Dan did something that, in hindsight, feels obvious. He called the researcher, not to start a company, not yet at least. He just wanted advice on how these insights might actually work in the real world. And so then Dan flew out to Tempe, Arizona to meet the researcher behind the study, Bob.
That first meeting went well. Bob was intrigued. He liked the idea of taking insights from social science and applying them to a real world problem like energy use. So they kept talking. And then on a follow up call, the conversation took a turn.
He said, I'm taking a sabbatical. Why don't I work with you guys on this? This would be really fun. But Bob's conviction and enthusiasm and Bob's reputation, though we weren't aware of it, but became aware of it pretty quickly, combined with that enthusiasm and conviction, really were kind of impetus to say, maybe this is actually an idea worth paying attention to.
Suddenly, this wasn't just an interesting idea anymore. Things actually started to move fast, really fast.
There was no company. I mean, it was the two of us. It was startups move quickly. So we went from unsure if we should do this to Bob's on board, we're committed, we've created the entity, allocated stock and raised our first round of capital, $1.5 million, all in 90 days.
In just 3 months, they went from maybe this could work to a real company, funded, formed, and ready to launch. The researcher they had flown out to meet in Tempe joined the company as their chief science officer. And together, the three of them began transforming something most of us ignore every month, our utility bill.
It didn't take long for Opower to see great results. Over time, these programs saved individuals between 10% and 18% of their energy consumption. And collectively, the impact has been enormous. But rather than hearing it from us, let's hear it from Alex.
To date, it's 43 terawatt hours of energy consumption.
Now, 43 terawatt hours is one of those numbers that sounds super impressive, but unless you work in the electricity business, I don't really understand what it means.
Yeah, me either.
Do you? Yeah.
No, yeah. Can we get that in plain English, please?
Okay. All right. So in plain English, 43 terawatt hours is enough electricity to power nearly 4 million homes for a year. Now, that would be like powering all of the houses in a state like Nevada or a state like Utah or Kansas.
Here's another way to picture it. That's about 480 million LED light bulbs running nonstop for 12 months. If that energy had come from coal, it would have required more than 20 million tons of coal, which is roughly 2,000 coal trains, each of them a mile long.
Oh my gosh, wow. And in power plant terms, it's close to a decade of electricity that would be generated from a power plant the size of the Hoover Dam. All of the savings from adding a simple chart on people's electric bill. None of this came from new technology or new regulations or new infrastructure. It came from a simple insight about human behavior.
So was this a risky venture? Alex and Dan didn't think so. And neither did the psychologist that did the original study. In fact, that researcher wasn't uncertain at all. It's fair to say that he knew it was going to work. So how did he know? And who was this guy? Who is this researcher? This guy that got all of this started?
Well, his name is Robert Cialdini, and he is often referred to as the Godfather of influence, but who we'll just frequently call Bob in this podcast. And in this special series, we're going to explore Bob's remarkable contributions to behavioral science and to science communication. We'll get to know the researcher whose work helped reduce electricity use around the world and shaped how we understand influence itself. But before we go any further, let's hear what Bob had to say about the Opower story.
That's the one that makes me smile the most when I think back on it, that was the impact of it. But what I loved about the whole process was that we took something that was very well known within the academic community and applied it to a particular problem, and we harnessed the power of the private sector to do it. My university would never have been able to do this if they were my partner in this. And the same with the government, which is encumbered by all kinds of political and budgetary issues and so on. But the private sector, and I never thought that I would partner with them, but these two guys were terrific, and the cause was right. And so I'll never make that mistake again, to think that, no, we don't belong as partners with the private sector.
Welcome to Behavior Groove's special series on the work of Robert Cialdini. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. In this episode, the first of 3, Kurt and I will share how Robert Cialdini, a social psychology professor and researcher at Arizona State University, impacted the world in ways we often take for granted. The first section of this episode will cover the research that led to the development of Opower.
The second section of this episode will discuss Cialdini's research strategies. And in the third section, we will discuss how he wrote and published the book that earned him the nickname, the Godfather of Influence.
Now, in episode 2, we're going to dive into his personal journey, how a kid from Milwaukee with a legitimate shot at pro baseball ended up becoming a world-class social psychologist. And in the third episode, we'll talk about his legacy, how his work reaches beyond a bunch of clever studies gathering dust in the hallowed halls of academia.
Okay, Tim, let's go back to the research that made Cialdini so confident that the Opower idea would work. How did it all begin?
Short answer, door hangers.
Wait, door hangers, those little pieces of paper that you hang on doorknobs? That's how this all started?
That's it. Door hangers are often used to get political or public service messages to people at their homes. But of course, as in all things, the study didn't actually begin with door hangers.
So that study began with a phone call.
He and his colleague, Wes Schultz, an environmental psychologist at California State University, San Marcos, had been asked a simple but important question. How can we get people to use less electricity? So to begin answering it, Wes and his graduate students launched the first phase of the study with a phone survey. They wanted to understand what people believed would actually motivate them and their neighbors to reduce their electricity use. In other words, if you were trying to convince someone to conserve energy, what kind of message would work best?
Yeah, so the researchers offered up 4 common reasons and asked which message would motivate them the most. Would people be motivated by saving money, protecting the environment, demonstrating responsibility for future generations, or by seeing how their energy use compared to their neighbors?
Consider that for a moment. How would you answer that question? Which of those messages do you think would motivate you the most? Now, in the phone survey, the answer was overwhelming. Most people said that the strongest motivator would be protecting the environment for future generations.
Not a huge surprise there.
No.
And it's, just to let you know, knowing about your neighbor's usage came in, drum roll please, dead last.
Dead last, of course. But then came the second phase of the study. Instead of asking people what they thought would motivate them, Cialdini, Schultz, and the research team tested which messages actually change behavior. And according to Cialdini, Wes Schultz took the lead on the field experiment.
He set up the situation with the utilities in the San Diego County area, where they would actually give us the data on people who were using certain amounts of energy in a particular month, depending on how the door hanger we put on their doorknobs once a week for a month. And the door hanger said one of four different things. It said, do this for the environment, do this to be socially responsible, do this to save on your bill at the end of the month. And the fourth one played the social proof card. It said, the majority of your neighbors have told us in surveys that they actively try to conserve energy.
The door hangers carried the same four messages from the phone survey, and they were randomly distributed to homes across several neighborhoods. And by the way, we should pause to note that the grad students who contributed to this groundbreaking study were Jessica Nolan, Noah Goldstein, and Vlad Grishkevicius. They have all gone on to impressive careers in behavioral science. But at the time, their job, along with a group of Cal State undergrads, was much less glamorous. They had to go into the neighborhoods each week and read the electricity meters in people's yards.
Wait, so Tim, they actually had to walk through these people's yards to go and read their electricity meters?
They did. Now, they had authorization from the local utilities and the proper credentials, just in case anyone asked.
Okay, man, I actually thought that psychology research was all about wearing a white lab coat and asking people weird questions. But you're telling me that they had to deal with mean guard dogs, with thorn-encrusted defense hedges, and man-eating sprinkler systems? All of that? That's what they were dealing with?
But I'm proud and happy to say that no undergraduates were harmed or sacrificed in the conduct of this research.
Whew, good to know. Okay. Let's get back to the study, Tim. What happened? What did the data actually say?
The data was everything. You had to make the data everything.
The biggest impact came from the social norm message. That was the one that said most of your neighbors are conserving energy. It was social proof. Households that received the message reduced their electricity usage by more than 10%, while none of the other messages made a significant difference.
And the thing that really surprised me the most was not just that social proof worked. I knew that social proof was going to work, but it was the only thing that worked. And the other was, contrary to what people proposed would be the thing that would influence them most. They got it completely reversed.
Okay, hold the phone. Let's go back to what Cialdini said about how people got things completely reversed. If the phone survey respondents were so confident about their motivations, why were they wrong? Don't we know our own motivations?
So what people recognized about the causes of their behavior is not to be trusted. They know a lot of things about their behavior and can report honestly and accurately in surveys, but not about the causes of their behavior. There are too many of them for them to isolate the right one.
The study revealed something deeper. What we think motivates us and what actually drives our behavior can be very different. And it reinforced something Cialdini had been studying for years. Social proof is incredibly powerful. Katie Milkman, a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, reinforced this.
So he wrote this wonderful paper in, I want to say, roughly 20 years ago, showing that if you put little door hangers on people's doors in California and tell them that they are using more energy than their neighbors, that gets them to cut back on their energy usage more than doing things like telling them they're wasting money and they could save money by using less, and that it's good for the environment to use less. But no, if I find out I'm the one in the neighborhood who's out of whack, that's the thing that's going to really motivate me to cut back.
In other words, social proof.
Social proof is powerful. Social proof drives people from childhood, from Neanderthal ages. That it has always been a fundamental and primal motivator of behavior. What happens with the norm, what the majority is doing, it's a magnet. And it pulls people to it.
This field experiment showed that when it came to reducing energy use, social proof was far more powerful than rational arguments, moral appeals, or even financial incentives. And social proof was one of the key tenets in Cialdini's work, one of his first of the 6 principles of influence. Now, we'll talk about those in just a minute. But first, remember where this insight led. It inspired Alex and Dan to build Opower, redesigning utility bills across more than a dozen countries. And the result? Massive energy savings across millions of households, and one of the most successful real-world applications of behavioral science that has ever been implemented. Opower became such a success that Oracle acquired the company in 2016 for more than $500 million, and the program is still operating at scale today. In other words, this wasn't just a clever idea, it was a powerful demonstration of what happens when behavioral science meets the real world. And Robert Cialdini, well, he was the researcher who helped make that all possible.
While the door hanger study was an amazing success and led to a huge real-world impact, let's take a step back for a moment. What led Cialdini to study social norms in the first place? There is a lot more to Robert Cialdini than just getting people to save energy. To understand that story, we need to go back to the early 1980s.
Now, if you've ever heard the name Robert Cialdini, it's probably because of his book, Influence.
Influence that revolutionized that. So many grad students who come today have read that book.
That was Richard Petty, world-renowned social psychologist from the Ohio State University, talking about how the book Influence made a huge impact on the field. Now, Influence has sold more than 7 million copies since its release back in 1984. It's been translated into 50 languages, and it has spent years on bestseller lists around the world. And the book lays out 6 research-based principles of persuasion, including the one we just discussed, social proof. Now, throughout the book, Bob tells stories from his own research and observations to show how these principles operate as mental shortcuts, automatic triggers that often lead people to say yes, maybe when they don't even want to say yes. And at the same time, he also explains how we can recognize these techniques and protect ourselves from being manipulated by them.
Fortune magazine listed it among the 75 smartest business books, and it's often ranked among the 100 greatest business books of all time. So, yeah, it's done pretty well.
Yeah.
And one reason for that success is simple. These 6 principles of influence are used by or used on just about every human being on the planet.
When Influence came out in 1984, it was actually a bit of a rarity. Between the years 1980 and 1985, only 4 books written by academic researchers made the New York Times bestseller list. Bob's book was one of them. The others, well, they were works by Carl Sagan, Richard Feynman, and Oliver Sacks. So not shabby company, Tim, right? Here's Adam Grant, best-selling author and professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, explaining why Influence worked so well.
It's not only one of the few books from the 80s that we still talk about in social science, it's also the best of them. Because when I think about what makes a book that translates social science great, it has to check 4 boxes. Number 1, it has to be rigorous. That's table stakes. 2, it has to be engaging. 3, it has to be useful. And 4, it has to have a big idea in it. And I think Bob was the first author to take social science and check even 3 of those boxes, let alone all 4, which is remarkable. He created a genre.
So, what exactly are the 6 principles of influence? We'll explore each of them more in greater depth throughout the entire series, but for now, here's a quick overview. And for those of you who are true influence aficionados, you probably know that Cialdini eventually added a 7th principle, but we're going to focus on the original 6 for right now. Okay, and before we do that, let's hear Bob explain how these principles should be used.
Here's how you can be effective. Here's how you can be successful and ethical. You point to the principle of influence that's in that situation naturally. You don't do anything to modify or exaggerate or accelerate or dissemble in that situation. You point to it. You raise it to consciousness. And if it's there, you're entitled to it ethically. Actually, I think it's not just ethically acceptable. I think it's ethically commendable that you point to one of these things that usually steers us correctly toward assent.
Let's start with the one we already discussed, social proof, which we just talked about with the door hanger study. As Bob writes in Influence, social proof is a convenient shortcut for determining how to behave. So instead of figuring things out from scratch, we often look to the behaviors of others to guide our own decisions.
Bob summed up the next principle, commitment and consistency, by saying that consistency is a central motivator of our behavior. He means that we are inclined to stay consistent with our actions and statements, and that we don't like to be flip-floppers in how we think and how we behave.
Yeah, the third principle is reciprocity, which says that if someone helps you out, you feel a need to help them out in return, and that this often happens at a subconscious level, so we don't even know that it's happening.
The fourth principle is authority, which Bob described as a deep-seated inability to defy the wishes of the boss. Suffice it to say that expert opinions matter too.
The fifth is scarcity, which everyone recognizes as the only 2 seats left at this price rule. We need to acknowledge that we tend to want an item that is rare or unique or limited more than an item that is easily acquired. And sometimes it's not even an item that we wanted in the first place.
And the sixth principle is liking, which is as simple and straightforward as asking, do I like you? Okay, so lastly, we're going to leave the seventh principle for later in the series.
Wait, Tim, we're not going to talk about the seventh now?
Well, not yet. The seventh principle was introduced like years later, so we're going to take this one chronologically.
We're building some suspense.
Yeah, okay. I guess you could put it that way. For now, let's step back and look at something even more interesting. How did Cialdini actually discover these principles in the first place? Because the way he went about studying influence was pretty unusual.
When we look at any great thinker, we usually find a group of people behind them, teachers, mentors, and colleagues who helped shape how they saw the world. Bob Cialdini was no exception. Several influential figures helped guide his thinking early in his career, people he met as a graduate student and as a young researcher.
We'll start at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Bob earned his PhD in social psychology. 2 professors played especially important roles in shaping his thinking, Chester Insko and John Thibault. Bob's doctoral advisor was Chet Insko.
I'm going to work with this guy, Chester Insko, who studies persuasion at UNC, at North Carolina. Right? So Chet was my major advisor, and he was the son of a Presbyterian minister from Kentucky, and he was very straight-laced. He was a very organized guy and a very linearly oriented guy. What I learned from Chet was how to trap an effect. That if you start out with a theory, and then, well, okay, if that's the theory, then by logical deduction, what do you do to prove some proposition, a hypothesis that is linearly related to the theory, right? And then you structure an experiment that captures that effect. And if it is there, it should be captured. And so that was very important. He gave me the tools of the logician's trade to be sure that what I was thinking through was logically appropriate for what I was doing.
The second mentor at UNC was John Thibault. Thibault was not Bob's direct advisor, but he profoundly shaped how Bob approached research questions. And Thibault had a very unusual way of doing it.
John would say, okay, let's say it's, how do people negotiate differently when they're the only one in the negotiation process with their negotiation partner versus when they are representing a group. They are representing a group. They're okay. And now, does that change how they negotiate based on that difference? All right. So instead of saying, well, let's look at the literature in social psychology and negotiation that refers to, that we can see whether that difference has been examined in some form or another, he would say, what do the great novelists of our society, of our culture, what have the great novelists said about this? Can we find examples of this sort of conundrum, of this sort of situation in the novels? And what do they say about it? Right. And then after we thought about that and gave some examples, he would say, well, what do the philosophers say?
Or as Bob would like to say,
we would go from Henry James to William James.
But that wasn't enough for Thibault.
And then he would say, if we examine that, what do our fellow or sibling disciplines say about this topic? What do the economists say about it? What do sociologists say about it? All right. What the anthropologists, what do they say about it? Is there any information there? And then at that point, he would say, now, what do social psychologists say about it? Now we would go to the journals. Now we would go. And it struck me that everybody else would start where John Thibault ended in the examination.
That approach stuck with Bob. Instead of starting narrowly within psychology, he learned to surround a problem from multiple angles before diving into the research.
But Inscoe and Thibault weren't the only influences. After finishing his PhD, Bob went to Columbia University for a postdoctoral position, where he worked with another towering figure in social psychology, Stanley Schachter. Now, Schachter made massive contributions to the field of social psychology, especially on affiliation and emotions.
It was Stanley Schachter, of course, a luminary of early social psychology, and I was a postdoc of his.
Bob tells a great story about something he learned from Schachter. At the time, Schachter had been studying isolation, but when he examined the data, something surprising appeared. The results weren't pointing toward the power of isolation. They were pointing toward the power of affiliation.
So Schachter did something many researchers struggle to do. He switched gears.
And I asked him, so why did you do that? How did that happen? And he said, well, I got into it and I realized that isolation is not where the power is in human interaction. It's in affiliation We are an affiliative species. I need to study those elements that are most representative of who we are, that where the real energy and depth and power is. That's what we should study. Right? I was so impressed because here was a guy, he was on a horse, he was going this way, and he got off that horse in the middle of a stream, got on another horse, going in the other direction, because that's what the data were telling him. No, there isn't a lot of power here, right? Go, and he realized he was studying the wrong thing. I said, well, what about people who, like Emily Dickinson, an amazing poet who was a recluse, and she did that. And he said, well, he was a smoker. In fact, it's what led to his demise. And he had the ash of his cigarette and he waved his hand dismissively, like Emily Dickinson, and the ash went past my eyes and exploded on the wall next to me. Right? And he said, "The hell with Emily Dickinson. What do you want to be, Cialdini? A poet or a social scientist? What do you want to be?" Wow. I'll never forget that. Go to the power. Be part of the power.
That lesson stuck with Bob. If the data points somewhere unexpected, well, then you need to follow that data. Don't force your results to match your theory. So, by looking for the most powerful influences on our behaviors, Bob began to see that the power resided in the elements of human condition that were the most foundational or fundamental, going all the way back to how we evolved.
First of all, it made me look to the most, I want to say primitive. The primitive isn't the right word. It's the wrong, the most primal elements of our behavior, of our choices. What are the things that have been built into us from evolution and from socialization from the start? Those are the most powerful things. If you look at the principles of influence that I ultimately came to, they're things like authority and social proof and liking and scarcity. They're in there. They're in there early on, right? They're the ones that have the most generative influence on our behavior, I think. They're the most powerful ones.
As these concepts began showing themselves in his research, Bob began to piece together the best parts of his mentor's thinking. And he did it in his own way.
This is what Schachter was telling me too. Follow the data. Insko was telling me, capture the effect, right? Thibault was telling me, surround it. Schachter was saying, follow it wherever it goes. If it goes in a way that you weren't predicting, don't try to fix things so that the study would now go and get that thing. If that was the more powerful effect, this other thing was in there. Study that. So the importance was you take the data. And when the data are in, nothing is more important than that.
The last major influence we want to discuss was the great psychologist William McGuire. McGuire was a professor of psychology at Yale University who was visiting Arizona State shortly after Bob joined the faculty. Bob had an informal discussion with McGuire when Bob picked him up from the airport. Bob asked McGuire what he thought would be a good starting point for understanding social influence.
And he said, use the practitioner's rule of thumb. The practitioners of social influence know what works by virtue of trial and error. They don't know why it works. That's not their job. It's our job. find out what the practitioners are doing. And that's what got me into the training programs of as many social influence professions, marketing, sales, advertising, public relations, as I could. It was to take that advice. That means there's power there. That means there's effectiveness there.
Together, these researchers, and please forgive the overt use of the word influence, well, because they were the influencers who influenced the godfather of influence in ways that shaped his research, writing, and ultimately his influence in the field.
In influence, Bob organized decades of research around these 6 principles of influence. But the way he did the research followed a structure too. And over time, Cialdini developed a set of strategies that helped him decide what was worth studying in the first place. And in this section, we're going to look at 3 of those strategies. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the influence of the mentors we just talked about. So let's get started with the first of these 3 strategies.
The first research strategy that Bob employed is simple. It's what he refers to as big effects. In psychology, researchers refer to the effect sizes from their studies to communicate how big a difference or change that their clever idea will make, or whether it's even noticeable at all. He got all this from working with Stanley Schachter.
A big effect size means that the intervention that they do makes a large, visible difference, the kind of difference that you can't easily ignore.
All right, big effects that you can see are triggered by relatively small activators that create explosive effects. That tells me there's a lot of power there.
Once you start looking for big effects, you start seeing them everywhere. For Bob, one of those moments came at a football game.
I would always catch myself thinking when I would see some event that was puzzling, some effect, why would they do that? Why would people do that? It just doesn't seem reasonable. And there must be a psychology to it.
One of Bob's favorite stories about his ideas happened when he was teaching at the Ohio State University. And it started in a pretty ordinary way. He was in his office, which happened to be located underneath the football stadium, working on a research problem.
And I was trying to think of all of those ways of getting the effect significant. And it's time to go to the game.
So Bob gives up on the problem he was trying to solve and makes his way into the stadium.
So I went through some corridors and I went out onto the into the bowl of the stadium, at which time the Ohio State football team ran onto the field and the place went into bedlam. People were up, they were bouncing, they were shouting, they were singing the fight song, they were spilling beer on one another, they were shouting, "We're number one." And I looked around me at all of this power.
And this is where something special is about to happen in Bob's mind.
And I could almost hear Stanley Schachter's voice. "Cialdini, you're studying the wrong thing. This is where the power is. Not that study that you need to play these tricks in order to get the effect to show other than whisper."
And there he is, looking right at the effect. Bob actually starts thinking about his experience.
And so I started that set me out to study basking in reflected glory, the tendency of people to want to share in the glory of those elements that they're associated with, who are successful, who fans, sports fans. So I started doing a series of studies on basking in reflected glory. It was clear that it was time to move away from studying that little thing I was playing around with, like a checkers game in my office that afternoon.
And this conclusion about studying large effect sizes shaped his career for many years and enabled the 6 original principles of influence to be so universal because they applied to nearly everyone on the planet.
The next research strategy that Bob talked about looks for
things that cause people to act out of character with their traits. So turns introverts into extroverts, turns consistent people into inconsistent, turns honest people into dishonest.
In other words, people generally behave in ways that match their personality. But certain situations can dramatically change how people act. And when Bob saw those moments, and when the situation overpowered personality, he knew there was something important to study.
A great example of this came from an unusual request Bob received from the National Park Service. They asked him to help solve a problem at Arizona's Petrified Forest National Park. Visitors were stealing the petrified wood. And not just a little, a lot. Park officials estimated that nearly 14 tons of petrified wood were being taken from the park every year.
In that study, Bob looked at how different messaging impacted whether or not park visitors would take home petrified wood, which is basically stealing. The data showed that most people don't steal petrified wood from the park, but those that do cause irreparable damage.
Now, most visitors would never think of stealing something from a national park. And what Bob and his colleagues found was very interesting. They found that the messaging that they saw mattered. One of the park signs tried to discourage theft by telling visitors that many people were stealing petrified wood. Now, the intention was to say, "This is a problem, stop it." But the message had the opposite effect. When visitors saw that sign, theft actually increased. People who normally wouldn't steal suddenly thought, well, if everyone else is doing it. But when the signs were changed to emphasize that most visitors respect the park and leave the wood where it belongs, well, then theft dropped.
Don't normalize the bad behavior. Marginalize it.
Bob's third research strategy involved looking for different and sometimes opposite paths that lead to the same behavioral outcome. So in other words, 2 completely different approaches that both end up producing the same result. Here's how Katie Milkman describes it.
Foot in the door versus door in the face, which are like concepts around making a small ask and then somebody, after they make that concession, might be more willing to make another concession. Or if you decline a large ask, now you're going to feel like you have to do something small for this person. Like, there are just so many insights.
Bob explained the difference between foot in the door and door in the face.
Bob also saw the interconnectedness of these observations. He could see how the principles of consistency and reciprocity were intertwined into these techniques.
Foot in the door is consistency. After you make a small, you say yes to a small request, then you're more likely to say yes to a logically related bigger request. Foot in the door is reciprocal concessions, reciprocity. If you say, can you do this? Can you do this? And people say no to it. And then you say, well, could you do this? You've made a concession to them. Now it's their turn to make a concession in return. That was what we found.
For years, the foot in the door method was the dominant strategy used in persuasion. Salespeople, fundraisers, and marketers all relied on the same logic: start small and build from there. But Bob began to wonder something. What if persuasion didn't always have to work that way?
Bob noted there is rarely a single path to our particular behavior. Why might someone refuse a request in one situation, but agree to the exact same request when it's framed differently?
And this was an idea in Bob's head for some time. And then one day, while walking to class well, let's hear the story from two business associates of Bob's from Influence at Work, Brian Ahern and Steve Martin. We'll let Brian start the story with Bob walking across ASU's campus one day.
He's lost in thought, and seemingly out of nowhere, right in front of him is this Boy Scout who says, "Hi, would you like to buy some tickets to the Boy Scout Circus? They're only $5 a piece." Cialdini politely said, "No, thank you." But before he could get away, the little boy did something significant. He said, "If you can't do that, would you buy some of our chocolate bars? They're only $1." Bob pulls out $2, gives it to the boy, starts to walk away, and then he stops and he thinks, "I don't like chocolate, but I do like dollars. And he just arranged for me to give the dollars I like for the chocolate I don't. Why'd I do that?"
Steve Martin jumps in.
So this kid has ingeniously arranged for me to have the candy that I don't really want and care for in exchange for the money that I actually quite like.
But simply asking the question isn't enough. Brian goes on.
So, mind of a social psychologist, he ruminates over this all the way back to his office, stumbles onto what he thinks is the right answer, but he's a scientist, so he's going to test it. Gets his research assistants together, tells them what happened.
And they design a study to check this out, with college students as their intended participants. The research team spread out and began one set of conversations this way.
I say, "Hi, I'm with the Juvenile County Detention Center. We're looking for people who'd be willing to be a chaperone on a day trip to the zoo for some juvenile delinquents. Would you be willing to help out on a Saturday?"
And the results weren't bad. They weren't really great either.
Only 17% of people who were asked that question said yes.
Then, with a separate group of students, the researchers started with this question.
"Hi, I'm with the Juvenile County Detention Center. We're looking for people who'd be willing to be a big brother or big sister to some juvenile delinquents in need." Now, we typically ask people to sign up for a period of 2 years, and it's a 2-hour-a-week commitment. Would you be willing to help out?
Steve goes on.
No one's going to say yes to that. Everybody says no.
Literally everybody. It is no surprise that there were 0 college students interested in making such a commitment. But then, following the lead of the Boy Scout in Bob's candy buying experience, the researchers asked,
"If you can't do that, would you be willing to be a chaperone on a day trip to the zoo for juvenile delinquents?"
And how did that go? Would asking a follow-up question to a strong no change the way people respond?
For that moment, we asked them to take these kids to the zoo, to Phoenix Zoo at the weekend, and they tripled the impact. So 3 times as many people now say, "Yeah, of course I'll take the kids to the zoo," that otherwise wouldn't have done.
Bob shared his thoughts.
And for me, this had to do with the door in the face technique, right? Where you say, please, you ask for a large request, people say no, and then you retreat to a more moderate request, and they're more likely to say yes to it. But at that time, the traditional sequential compliance effect was the foot in the door. You start with a small request, not the large one. You start with a small you get them to say yes to it, and then you advance to the more moderately sized request. And it turns out that both of them produce increased compliance.
It's a rare thing when someone is able to translate an experience of buying chocolate that you don't even like to designing a study to test the idea to ultimately making a rich observation of social psychology.
I think is the surprising, entertaining genius that he notices something happen that shouldn't happen. And then his genius is to devise some experiment, some manipulation of sorts, I use that word advisedly, in an experimental way, to test whether or not it was just a fluke or whether it is something endemic to the human condition. And it's those kind of things. So whether it's waiters putting mints next to the check when they bring the bill, whether it's asking people to kind of take a group of delinquent kids to Phoenix Zoo this weekend, and everything in between. Genius, absolute genius.
That's high praise, but it's fitting. Bob used his real-world research chops to identify opposite behaviors that weren't artificially stimulated in a laboratory. For Bob, the real gems were in asking college students to take kids to the zoo or in hanging electricity usage door hangers in neighborhoods in Southern California. This section of Robert Cialdini Impacting the World One Experiment at a Time is sponsored by the influence principle known as social proof, because social proof reminds us that popularity is a signal for value. Not always correctly, by the way, but powerfully. You see, humans are not so much truth-seeking machines as we are identity-seeking machines. We discover identity by seeking alignment with others. We naturally want to connect to social groups and have social groups accept us. We want to identify with others and be accepted by others. So, if you want to get more people on your bandwagon, share the data about how the majority, or quickly growing minority, of people are already on board. And now, back to our regularly scheduled episode.
Before Bob got to writing the book, he took these strategies to the field. He needed to understand the foundations of influence. At that time, there were hundreds of papers and ideas on influence without a cohesive way of looking at the topic. Some of this work went back a long way.
We can go all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Aristotle is one of the first to think about persuasion and how it works. In Rhetorics, Aristotle stated, "Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, there are three kinds. The first kind depends on the personal character of the speaker, the second on putting the audience into a certain frame of mind, the third on the proof." So, over 2,300 years ago, persuasion was being explored.
But specific psychological research into how we are influenced didn't get started until the mid-1900s. Many researchers started to explore the facets of persuasion. Leon Festinger explored cognitive dissonance and our need for consistency in how we view ourselves. Carl Hovland studied communication and attitude change, looking at source credibility, the message, the audience, and what changed. The field expanded into social identity, peer pressure, and conformity studies by great researchers such as Muzaffar Sharif, Solomon Asch, and Stanley Milgram.
To be fair, there were countless researchers that brought their distinct insights into this field, and there was much to draw from, more than we can talk about here. By the 1970s, thousands of papers had been published on the mechanisms and methods that can be used to influence a person. And at that time, much of the work was being conducted in laboratories of colleges and universities around the world. However, there was no single unifying, comprehensive theory or even a framework for how persuasion worked. In essence, there were hundreds of different methods that could be used to change someone's thoughts, beliefs, and actions, but none of them were really tied together.
Bob entered the field with a desire to bring order to this chaos. He examined all the research. Thousands of papers from different labs were reviewed, and he recalled the advice of William McGuire, the great social psychologist who visited Bob in his early days at ASU. McGuire's recommendation was simple.
Follow the practitioner's rule of thumb.
So he turned his focus to what practitioners were doing.
What are the people who are professionals at getting attitude change or behavior change, right? And whose business relies on it? That means there's power there. That means there's effectiveness there.
McGuire's words pushed Bob to join sales organizations, to sign up to sell their products, to actually become a salesperson, all so he could take their training courses. He wanted to learn what the practitioners did, how companies taught their people to sell. If they were truly persuasive, Bob wanted to hear firsthand what worked.
I was going undercover and would go into various influence training programs, salespeople, marketers, and so on. I would use different names for myself, and I would even dress differently based on what the organization was.
Bob was looking for raw material to create something that revealed the truth, like the way a mosaic artist searches for the right pieces to place into his mosaic.
There were hundreds of tactics and strategies and so on, but only 6 categories in which you could put most of those tactics. Right? So that was one thing. That was it. That was very interesting to me. And they weren't doing that. In fact, they didn't even have categories like that, conceptual categories. If you asked them what was successful, why it was successful, why this was successful, which I would always do, they would have circular answers. It's successful because when we use it, we get a lot more compliance. That kind of, they weren't answering it. It wasn't their job. It's my job. It turned out that's my job. Find out what the conceptual reason for success was there. And so that's where I could then take that information and do research on it. That was the plan.
Bob took on the job to build out the scientific evidence, then to consolidate the proven methods and techniques into his 6 key categories. Today, these methods and techniques, presented as the 6 principles of influence, are the best representation of how influence works. They are the gold standard of explaining how humans influence other humans. It truly is remarkable work. But Bob still had to write the book. But who is the book's audience going to be? Who was it for? This wasn't a typical textbook like most scientists at the time wrote.
When I was writing, behavioral scientists didn't write for the general public. That was seen as below them. I mean, it was not scientific enough to have to write in a way that planed away all of the details and so on. But it seemed to me very important to do it, that we were obligated to do it by the contract that we had entered into with the public.
So he wrote the book to give
those people who are interested in knowing that, just so that they understand themselves better or understand how to be more effective in the world around them, or understand how to resist anybody who pushes those buttons in them in a way that's undue or unethical.
In Bob's mind, the book should be easy to read, but also be bulletproof from a research perspective. So what was it like writing for those 2 audiences?
When I write, not just a sentence, but when I write a paragraph or a section, over one of my shoulders is an academic expert on that topic, somebody I respect whose work would be related to that section, and you have to satisfy that person. So I get the scholarship right, and then on the other shoulder I put a neighbor, an intelligent neighbor, somebody who is interested in the world, interested about the world in which we live, and I have to satisfy him or her too before I allow myself to go on. So it has to be readable, it has to be engaging for somebody who doesn't know the literature.
Why was that? Why 2 entirely different audiences? It was because he wanted to share the story with the people who funded the original research, American taxpayers.
They would fund our research with their tax dollars, with their contributions to our universities, right? And we would do research that would be of interest to them. Therefore, we should tell them what we had found out about them and human behavior, or behavior in general, with their money. So it seemed to me that writing a book for the larger audience was not just instructive and worthy. It was kind of we were obligated to do it, to fulfill our end of the contract.
So Bob went about doing the research for the book.
As a professor, Bob had a relationship with a textbook representative. This guy's name was John Staley, and John asked Bob if he had considered writing a book. Bob told him he was already in the process, but that the book wasn't only for academic audience. In fact, it was for everybody. Staley was somewhat reluctant. Remember, researchers didn't write popular press books back then.
And he said, well, we have a trade book division. So what? Give me a couple of chapters. I've got a long plane ride and to back home, and I'll read it. Now I'll give you any hints, or maybe I'll give it to some of those folks over in that unit, and they can give you some feedback on this. He didn't even get out of the airport in Indianapolis where he went. He called me from the airport and said, "We want this book."
It was, as they say, destiny. Influence was initially released into the academic market with more than 100 pages of citations so that every point could be defended and researched independently. There were chapter summaries and exercises. It was rock solid in its scholarship, and it was also easy to read, just as Bob planned it.
Yet, with all of the thoughtful writing, his editor, who was from the academic side of the publishing house, thought promoting it to a popular audience was a bad idea. So she withheld funding.
Because she says it would be like throwing money down a pit. This book isn't going anywhere. There's nothing's going to resuscitate it by making it public. That somebody named Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University has published a book on influence.
But here's what the editor failed to grasp. This book connected with how people actually live. It spoke to how we as people are influencing others as well as being influenced every single day. Cialdini bridged that gap by presenting rigorous research through stories anyone could understand and providing a framework that we could all use.
And the real magic of the book? Bob's humility. And that resonated with a lot of readers, including Katie Milkman.
Who else would think to start a book by saying, all my life I've been a patsy, right?
So that generous amount of humility, which is a theme we'll return to in some depth in episode 2, combined with really good scholarship and a clear, accessible writing style, well, Influence took off. And 3 years after it was published, it appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. And Bob says much of its power came from the way he studied persuasion in the first place.
The longer I spend in the pursuit of knowledge, the more I come to believe that work in the field is more representative of the kind of knowledge that represents how people behave in their everyday interactions with one another. And that's the place to seek it in the field.
It could be argued that much of his work on the principles of influence was about codifying techniques already in use by sales and marketing professionals. And that's a reasonable but simplistic argument to make. What makes Bob's work truly revolutionary is his ability to make translations. He observes behaviors in the real world, studies them with academic rigor, then turns them into stories that anyone can understand.
On top of that, many of his research observations became tools that could be applied at scale. And when they did, they made a tremendous impact on the world around us. And all along, his goal was to help unsuspecting people recognize the tactics of influence and to make better decisions, especially for patsies like he'd once been. But he didn't stop there. He also gave professionals who use these principles a moral compass, showing them how to practice persuasion ethically.
His discoveries revealed fundamental truths about human behavior. When people learned how much electricity their neighbors were using, they adjusted their consumption. When fans wore their team's colors, even during losing seasons, they signaled something deeper than loyalty. They were reinforcing their social bonds. Bob went beyond the standard foot in the door approach and found that when someone asked for an outrageous commitment at first, then backed down to something more reasonable, people were far more likely to say yes than if they'd heard the reasonable request from the start.
One experiment at a time, Cialdini's research has improved the well-being of people around the globe. Now, a word from our second principle of influence, commitment and consistency.
This episode is brought to you by the influence principle of commitment and consistency. It's the reason you're still watching that terrible TV series you started 3 seasons ago. Here's the thing, once we commit to something, even something tiny, our brain rewires itself to stay consistent with that commitment. It's why the foot in the door technique works. Get someone to agree to put a small sign in their window, and 2 weeks later, they're 4 times more likely to put a billboard in their lawn. Well, want to actually follow through on your goals? Write them down. Tell someone. Make it public. Your brain will literally fight to keep you consistent with that commitment. Want others to follow through? Get micro commitments first. Small yeses lead to big yeses. It's not magic. It's the psychology of persuasion. Now we return to our regularly programmed Cialdini episode.
That wraps up the first of our 3-part series. In episode 2, we will explore how an Italian kid in a predominantly Polish neighborhood in a historically German city who only wanted to be a baseball star growing up becomes one of the most influential psychologists in the world.
Yeah, what were those influences that led him to become the researcher that he is? What shaped his thinking as well as his ethics? We'll start episode 2 by looking at a paper he wrote about the state of social psychology. He told the readers, who were mostly research psychologists, that he thought it best if they broke up.
A breakup scene at the beginning of the episode. I wonder how that will turn out.
The Behavioral Grooves series on Robert Cialdini's life and legacy is written and reported by Kurt Nelson and Tim Houlihan. Editing and sound design by Caroline Schaefer with generous assistance of Orange Wall. Thanks to Ben Granlund and Alex Belanger for design and marketing. Original music composed by Tim Houlihan. Additional music has been licensed through Pond 5. Transcripts with key source citations are available on the episode webpage. Thanks to the guests who contributed to this episode, including Dan Yates and Alex Lasky, Adam Grant, Richard Petty, Katie Milkman, Brian Ahern, and Steve Martin. Thanks especially to Dr. Robert Cialdini for his generous support of this project. This series is a production of Behavioral Grooves, hosted by Tim Houlihan and Kurt Nelson, where we explore the human condition through a behavioral science lens. It is copyrighted 2026 by Behavioral Grooves. Content may be used with written consent. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.